Welcome back to episode 13 of the Lantern Sports Podcast, hosted by the Lantern Sports Desk here at The Ohio State University. I'm Steven Kishpaugh, Assistant Sports Editor to the Lantern, and joining me as always, we have Assistant LTV Sports Producer Gabe Burggraf, Sports Editor Jacob Benge, and LTV Sports Producer Casey Smith. Boys, it's a very odd week for us coming off Saturday. But, first, as always, we want to just give a quick word around Ohio State athletics. Ohio State women's soccer players Talani Barnett, Kayla Fisher, and Emma Sears have all been named to the United Soccer Coaches All-North Region team for the 2022 season. Barnett and Fisher each earned first-team distinctions, while Sears took home second-team honors. Both the swim and dive teams and the men's basketball team take a trip to North Carolina tomorrow. The swim and dive teams are going into the Toyota U.S. Open, and then the men's basketball team travels to face Duke at Cameron Indoor Stadium. And then finally, we have the women's basketball team also traveling tomorrow to take on Louisville in the ACC Big Ten Women's Basketball Challenge. So, to start off here, I know that we have a certain someone giving me a smirk, Gabe. I think you have some propaganda to spread, so why don't you just kick the floor off, man?
Well, if you are an avid Lantern Sports Podcast listener, you know throughout the year I was saying, Ohio State truly wasn't going to face its real test until they played Michigan. And I'll just say, look what happened. Because Michigan played a complete game and Ohio State played an incomplete half, and maybe a little bit more than that, but not enough to get anywhere close to a victory in this one. I'm really impressed with what Michigan did, traveling to Columbus on a day that really the weather didn't necessarily help the Wolverines like it did last year in the Big House in Ann Arbor, but they came to Columbus and left with a victory.
And you talking about playing an incomplete half. I think on defense they played an incomplete 6 plays because 382 of Michigan's, 530 yards of total offense came on 6 plays. So that leaves 148 yards on 54 other plays. Ohio State had more 0 or negative rush plays allowed by Michigan than they did runs of 10 or more yards. And so take those 6 chunk plays, 5 that went for touchdowns, out of the equation, and they're only giving up 2.74 yards per play. So Jim Knowles said that, he really wants to limit a team to 5 explosive plays or less. Well, Michigan beat that threshold, and it came back to bite the Ohio State defense because those 6 big plays, there were more big plays, but 6 in particular, 6 of the longest plays that Michigan had, 5 of them went for touchdowns. So,
yeah, Casey, and you mentioned how Jim Knowles said after the game that it was the explosive plays that ultimately was Ohio State's Achilles heel. And anytime you have obviously 4 or 5 plays that go 60-plus yards, 4 touchdowns, it's gonna be a hard day on the gridiron. And so Ryan Day talked afterward that it's gonna be a tough pill for Ohio State to swallow coming off of its first home loss to Michigan in well over 2 decades. I believe one of the players on Michigan's roster the last time that happened went by the last name Brady. So that's
wait, who is that, Jacob? Who is that?
Perhaps one of the greatest NFL football players there was.
And is.
Was is crazy. But continue with your train of thought, Mr.
When we
Ben.
flip to the NFL podcast.
Is J.J. McCarthy, did he play better than Tom Brady did at his entire career in Michigan?
That's a good question because Ryan Day and Ohio State Jim Knowles, they all said the passes Michigan would make, they weren't, right on the money. They weren't Heisman-esque throws, but they were just where Michigan needed in order to get the touchdowns it needed to defeat Ohio State on its home turf. And that's ultimately all the Wolverines needed was just a chance. And that 3-point lead Ohio State had at halftime was enough and a chance for Michigan to ultimately lay down the 22-point win it had.
Right, because, when Cornelius Johnson's going for just absolute bombs down the field where guys like Cam Martinez and then even on a long run, Lathan Ransom is his back is to the line of scrimmage. Cam Brown misses a tackle in the open field. There's just little tweaks here and there. And I saw a tweet that was talking about Cam Martinez. I can't remember how it was trying to make a metaphor or simile about how flat-footed he was on that one touchdown where he got crossed up. But, it kind of like you mentioned, Jacob, when guys are that wide open, you don't have to be perfect. You have a little bit of room for error. And I think that comes down to sort of the aggressive nature of Ohio State's defense, where they were bringing a lot of pressure, a lot of zero blitzes and stuff like that, and sometimes especially on the Cam Brown missed tackle, I believe it was Lathan Ransom got through the line of scrimmage, and he was just steps away from sacking J.J. McCarthy.
Absolutely. And I like that you talked about not every ball was on target, perfectly placed. In the Michigan postgame presser, they also talked about, Cornelius Johnson and McCarthy talked about, they'd practiced it during the week, kind of over the shoulder, going back to the shoulder, catching over the shoulder, back to the shoulder. And Cornelius Johnson said, that really kind of went out of the window. And he looked around, he's like, where is the defense? So it was one of those things where they said they prepped for tighter coverage and it wasn't there. But also that's what happens when you run man blitzes and you run man and you don't set up more over-the-top zone looks. Is like, if you're going to lose one-on-one matchups, you can't put those players out there against guys who will cook them if it's just in their hands. Like, McCarthy did a great job of getting the ball out of his hands and to his playmakers, and also, that offense fooled the Ohio State defense into running things that advantaged the Wolverines.
Right, and just real quick, Steven, I know you want to talk real quick. When you talk about playing man coverage and Jim Knowles' defense, the way it's set up is putting corners on the islands and trusting them. But, I mean, when you do that, isn't that kind of funny how much of a difference it is between Notre Dame, where after that game, everybody was saying Ohio State's defense was bend, don't break, but this was break, don't bend pretty much.
And you guys were talking about just, how aggressive the defense played on Saturday. I kind of have the exact opposite feeling about the offense. Listen, I'm not going to pretend like I'm a football guru. I know exactly what the X's and O's are in a playbook. But it seemed to me like, Ryan Day just kind of lost that aggressive edge that he usually saves for big games like this. And we've kind of seen a little bit of a pattern where Ryan Day, in these big games, if he's not sticking to his original game plan, it's very, very not like the Ohio State offense to just go for dink and dunk passes, and then at the same time, that 1st and 35, people forget it was they got it down to a 4th and 7. So it was a very it's not like it's an easy 4th down conversion, but it's more manageable, and it's something that we have almost come to expect the Buckeyes to try, and they didn't do it. And CJ Stroud said in the press conference after the game that he wanted to go for it, and he trusted Coach Day's decision to not go for it. But at the end of the day, we saw exactly what happened when Ohio State played conservatively. And in the second half, they scored 3 points. They only scored 3 points in the game that they're supposed to win every year. And I know a lot of fans think that that's unacceptable.
Well, that is unacceptable. I was talking about that earlier today. If you're the number one offense in the country, you think you are, you cannot score 23 points in the biggest game of the year. And you have to give a lot of credit to what Michigan did on the defensive end, playing good coverage over the top. Other than the Marvin Harrison long touchdown catch, and the Emeka Egbuka 44-yarder. Right. Other than those, this was a very tough game for Ohio State to get anything going through the air. And you kind of expected, as Ohio State went on this season, it seemed like here and there they were running it more, they were passing it more. And as much as they looked balanced against inferior opponents, there wasn't any real balance in this game, play calling or just yardage-wise in terms of moving down the field. Even against Penn State, you saw them go down the field, and, they had, before the half, they went for it for the touchdown, and they didn't get it, but they had an opportunity to push it into the end zone. And at the end of the day, you can't settle for field goals and stalling drives against a good offense, which is torching your defense. And also, you can't commit unnecessary penalties, They started the possession that you were talking about, the 1st and 35, on the Michigan side of the field. And they got 25 yards worth of penalties to get 1st and 35. And whether you agree or disagree with the play call that was the pitch on 1st and 35, at that point you're thinking, this is 4-down territory to potentially get 35 yards. So I kind of understand it, and Casey, I think we both agreed that, Ryan Day took his offense off the field, but he didn't stop trying to score on that drive.
Right, because, there have been some developments recently that show on that play it should have been a fake punt. And, I think it's very interesting that video comes out. And then Jim Harbaugh even says afterwards, Ohio State was dead to rights. Michigan was dead to rights.
Absolutely. Right.
Mitch Rossi? Yeah,
Well, maybe not for Mitch Rossi, but he would have had green grass.
Right. It was a 15, 20-yard gain, and, hey, they would have been set up shop.
Yeah.
And when you're down 4 points in that situation, imagine the spark that would have, and the life that would have given to the shoe. Because at that point, it was the momentum was starting to shift in Michigan's favor, and it was a very bleak atmosphere at times in the shoe, being down 4 points in the second half and really not getting much going. Defensively, Ohio State gets a big stop. It's not really a great punt from Brad Robbins, and Ohio State's set up with plus territory. And after the penalties, the headbutt by G. Scott is inexcusable. In a game where you have to be this disciplined, and then there's a false start as well on the punt formation. So, you just have to be disciplined in that situation. Still, it would have been a sizable gain and a first down. And if you look back at the video, Jesse Mirko he wasn't really expecting the punt.
And they almost blocked it.
Yeah,
because of the way he rolls,
exactly.
Michigan came after it. So it would have been the perfect time to counter.
Exactly, because the way the line was set up, they don't really care if a guy's able to almost as a defensive end play contain. They don't care if you're getting around the edge because Mitch Rossi's just going to run, 5-10 yards or so. And that's all you really need. You just kind of have to wall up. And then imagine Tommy Eichenberg as a lead blocker with how violent he is and just some of his tackles. It would be like the water boy going on the lead blocker on a fake field goal at the end of that game for the SC LSU Mud Dogs.
You mentioned something that I wanted to talk about at the beginning, but it completely slipped my mind. Penalties killed the Buckeyes this game. It was unbelievable how many times they would seem to get a stop or seem to start shifting the momentum in their favor, and then a penalty. The biggest one, aside from G. Scott's, because like you said, Casey, that's inexcusable, especially for the biggest game of the year. But the one that really, really turned it around, in my opinion, was the pass interference call on Lathan Ransom in the end zone. That they had. Was it Lathan Ransom or what? I don't remember.
Hickman.
It wasn't Ronnie Hickman. My bad. It was Ronnie Hickman. But they had Michigan stopped, and they were gonna have to settle for a field goal and give the Buckeyes the ball back. With I don't know if it would have been a one possession game, but it still would have been a single digit game. And then Ronnie Hickman gets called for the pass interference in the end zone, and you could just feel just the energy in Ohio Stadium deflate completely. That is, in my opinion, the defining play of the game because Ohio State, they just could not stop stepping on themselves with penalties, giving Michigan free yards. And in a game where you weren't getting stops, especially down the field in your press man coverage, you can't commit these types of penalties or else you're going to lose the game. And then we saw exactly what happened.
Right, because it would have made it, if you hold them to a field goal there, it would have made it 27-20. Ohio State gets the ball back. And that's that Egbuka long strike that I was talking about. That drive stalls out at the end after a great play in the secondary from Sainristil to break up that pass attempt to Stover that would have been a touchdown. But, another big factor with Ohio State being down 11, they would have had to go for 2, and they haven't attempted a 2-point conversion this year. So who knows how that would have gone to try and cut it to a field goal. So if you hold them to a field goal there, if you hold Michigan to a field goal, then it's a 7-point game. You drive down, potentially score a touchdown, and then you don't have to be faced with that 2-point conversion attempt as well. We may be looking at a different outcome. Michigan may still have won because those two, you can't deny those 75 and 85 yarders there at the end. Very impressive. 4 plays, and let's see. Let me do some math here. 7, carry the 1, 167 yards in 4 plays on Michigan's last 2 touchdowns. So, yeah, you hold them to a field goal there, and who knows? We might be looking at a different outcome.
Yeah, very different outcome indeed. And, it never really felt the same for Ohio State either. Ohio State only had 2 plays of more than 24 yards against Michigan on Saturday. And I think the defining play of the game for me was probably Donovan Edwards' first big rushing touchdown there, just because I think that's what really took all of the air out of any sort of momentum Ohio State had, because once Donovan Edwards broke that first tackle and ran up the sideline, and it had a look to it from the press box that Michigan fans in particular will probably remember that touchdown run for a while, especially being in the shoe there, because already Ohio State was down 31-23 at this point. There was about 7 minutes left in the fourth quarter, and I think we had talked after the Maryland game about how much time Ohio State would have the lead in the fourth quarter of a game and not really feel too threatened in terms of losing it. But at that point, Ohio State was already trailing at the latest point in the game it had in the season, down 8 already. So as you mentioned, having to go for 2 would have been tough, and particularly because Michigan's defense was so stout. And if we talk about that, even though Ohio State forced more 3-and-outs, the Michigan's defense still answered the bell and wouldn't back down from Ohio State's pass attack, which still saw 2 receivers finish with over 100 receiving yards, and rushing attack, which ultimately was probably Ohio State's biggest concern offensively, just because it didn't have a reliable ball carrier, it felt like, against Michigan, even though Chip Trayanum really had a valiant effort, I felt, for arguably his first game toting the rock.
Yeah, and that's also another interesting point that I noticed throughout the game. Like, Mayan Williams played in this game. And I know Travion Henderson didn't, but Mayan Williams played in this game. So it's not like he was unavailable. And for some reason, Ryan Day was just feeding Chip Trayanum. Now, granted, Chip Trayanum's a very talented player, and it was probably very difficult for him for his first real consistent playing time at Ohio State to be in the game. But you just had Dallin Hayden carry the rock more than anybody throughout the season just the week before. And with Mayan Williams being healthy, I don't know why Day didn't go with kind of like a Hayden-Williams combo, especially, considering the fact that last week Hayden was making some absolutely outstanding runs.
For me, it's just interesting because Hayden scored 3 times against Maryland when the number 1 went down in Travion on the road there. And then Mayan gives it a go and obviously cannot be 100% the bell back for them. So the question I have is there something that happened to Hayden during the week where he had a bad week and Chip had a great week and Day just made the decision, or Alford made the decision to play Chip? We'll never know, likely. But, at the end of the day, I believe Chip caught a couple out of the backfield too. I think he had a catch or 2. And he was pretty nimble when he was out there running. Aside from a couple runs that were squashed out very quickly, he had some nice mobility and broke some tackles. And like Jacob, you said, I thought he played pretty well for the situation he was in. He's not a natural running back, so it's a little bit weird. It was just a little bit weird to me seeing it from camera deck. Is that's not number 5, the guy who just gouged the Terrapins and has been playing a lot of reps as running back. Because I think, we also saw Xavier Johnson used a little bit and a couple of different formations, but, not so much involving the running backs and those backfield players in the passing game either, when you're not able to throw the ball down the field because Michigan's playing over the top. And again, credit to them because they got pressure and they got to the ball in the air and was able to knock it out, like you said. Stover a couple times, good coverage on an island against Stover, 4th and 2, going for it down the seam. So you got to tip your hat to the Wolverines defense because they backed up their performance from last year. And this is a team, we keep saying, if Ohio State's offense plays to the capacity it can play, the defense is not a problem. But when you only score 23 or 27 points, regardless of the conditions, the defense is not going to win you that game. The offense has to control and score enough to command this victory.
And I think because it was the first version of the game in Columbus in 4 years, there's just this weird, eerie, numb, still feeling around campus that I felt because of the stunner that the loss brought with it. I don't think many people expected, obviously, Ohio State to lose at home to Michigan, especially after a year in which it's heard nothing but being and lacking toughness and discipline and things like that. And so now and you mentioned the pass game. C.J. Stroud mentioned post game that he's someone who didn't want to lose out of anybody the most. He wanted to take down Michigan. He wanted to have that moment, and now he even admitted that he's going to be known as someone who couldn't beat Michigan, who couldn't take that next step for Ohio State as a signal caller. And so I thought CJ really played well. He gave Ohio State some opportunities. It didn't feel like Ohio State had two receivers finish with over 100 receiving yards and a touchdown apiece. But that's just the way Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka have played for Ohio State this season. CJ Stroud finished with 349 passing yards, which is a terrific number in itself, 2 touchdowns itself. It didn't feel like he had 2 interceptions. He had the one that felt pretty momentous there, but the other one came a little bit later. It felt like in the second half that just didn't swing too much momentum. But it wasn't his worst performance, and arguably, just like last season, as you mentioned, Gabe, he put the offense on his back when Ohio State needed to, and Ohio State just couldn't support him.
So, Gabe, you made some interesting points when you were talking. You said it was very similar to how you said it was very similar to last year's game, and you did say that. You said the same thing happened twice in a row.
I don't think you'll have to scrub back. I'm editing it. I'm sure I'll scrub back, but
he'll just delete it.
What I said was, this was the kind of same way that Michigan, ended up with the victory. These games were not similar at all.
Okay.
In my mind, these games were not similar at all because Ohio State went in the second half up, but playing, I think we can all say, not good football. If they played better in the first half, they were up 10-3, they give up. They were controlling the game. Last year, did it really feel like Ohio State was controlling the game at any point?
Right. No.
No, I think they lost control of the game in the same way. That opening drive by McCarthy in Michigan to take the lead, and then the final minute plus a decent chunk of change in the second half, Michigan goes up by 2 scores. That drive was kind of eerily reminiscent, but it was the way that they got attacked and the way that, there didn't seem to be the same fight from the offense. In the same way that, in Notre Dame, it seemed like, okay, we got punched in the mouth. We're going to go out here and we're going to give it our best shot to win the game. And if we win, we win. If we lose, it's week 1. Like, it is what it is. But it didn't have that kind of the game, like, hatred feeling. Like, we got punched in the mouth. It's 24-20. We're going to give our all to do whatever we can, make any play we can. And it just felt like the moment might have gotten to them more than they embraced the moment.
I want to mention something, just maybe you guys can call me crazy for this, but when it comes to nationwide recruiting, there's a fine line when it comes to culture. And there were some people who were saying that, when you recruit these 5 stars who are not from Ohio and don't get who are not born in the culture, that they don't, that, they're not completely bought into it like people from Ohio are. And I'm not sure how true that is, but it is something interesting to think about because as someone who's from out of state and someone who didn't grow up in the culture, I'm still kind of myself, getting accustomed to just all the hatred and bitterness that Ohio State and Michigan have towards each other. Despite me being here for a few years, I'm not that deep into the fandom yet. So I'm thinking maybe potentially that could be a factor. And, I think some of that has to do with coaching as well, or where, you're ill prepped for the biggest game of your season. Some of that maybe have to do with personalities, but I think a lot of it also has to do with the coaching.
I don't know if I'd say it's necessarily the coaching. I think it's just,
the penalties are definitely coaching.
The penalties are definitely coaching, and that was the thing that in the presser for Michigan, Cornelius Johnson basically said, I was wide open. I was going to taunt, but I knew I couldn't. When he was scoring his second touchdown, he was like, I'd love to, let him know we're here and we're going to win this game. But he had to restrain himself because that's the way that they've been preparing for this game. No nonsense, all business for the last, 365 days.
Okay, so with all that being said, for some reason, there's still a chance that Ohio State can make the college football playoff. and they're going to need a lot of help, especially conference championship weekend. Presumably tonight with the college football playoff rankings, I'm gonna assume this is recorded before the rankings are released, so I'm gonna guess it's gonna be like some combination of Georgia, Michigan, USC, and TCU. Don't know the exact order they're gonna put them in, but
I'll give you an exact order.
Right.
Georgia,
TCU,
Michigan, TCU, USC.
There you go.
And then
okay.
either Alabama or Ohio State. That's the thing that we're gonna be monitoring, I'm sure, is Alabama, Ohio State. Because if Alabama's ahead of Ohio State, the towel has been thrown in by the committee. It is what it is. For Ohio State fans.
I mean, even if Ohio State's behind Alabama, they're not out of the woods, because if TCU and USC lose, Alabama and Ohio State slide into that 3 and 4 spot right there.
well, remember we also got number 5 LSU sneaking in there a little bit in the SEC championship game. If they somehow, hold on,
that's done with 3 losses.
Right.
Well, no. But what if they win?
If they win, Georgia falls to like 2 or 3. Okay, so what's our hypothetical?
Okay, so let's make this hypothetical. Let's say Michigan beats Purdue, so they would be in. Let's say Utah loses to USC and one of TCU and USC lose, and then LSU beats Georgia. What would your hypothetical playoff scenario look like
Is
then?
Ohio State 5 or 6?
Ohio State would be technically LSU would be 5 in this scenario, right?
No, because they got beat last week.
Oh, you're absolutely right. A&M. Yeah, you're absolutely A&M. Okay, yeah. So they're definitely not in. But we'll go. Alabama is ahead of Ohio State in this scenario, even with 2 losses.
So if Alabama's ahead of Ohio State and TCU loses to Kansas State, USC beats Utah,
yes,
Alabama's in.
Okay.
And then Ohio State's sitting there at 5. They go to the Rose Bowl. They play Washington.
Okay, gotcha. So I definitely think that watching this, selection show tonight is gonna be very interesting, especially just heading into conference weekend, because there's still a reasonable scenario where Ohio State can sneak into the college football playoff.
This is a very interesting year because, Alabama's not going to be in the SEC championship game, but you could argue that they are a top 2 team in the country right now. Because their losses are Tennessee with Hendon Hooker on the road by
3.
By a field goal in a game that they almost won. And then you've also got, that other loss, which, again, a play or 2 determines that game. Compared to Ohio State, which got its behind handed to it in its home stadium in a game that was the game day destination, the Fox Noon destination. All of the world was watching that game like they will the national championship and the playoff games. And Ohio State underperformed.
If you want a box score watch, then yeah, that looks like a bad loss. But take away those 5 plays that I talked about, well, even the 6 plays, and then that's 38 points off the board for Michigan.
See, but that's my point. If you take 6 plays off the board for Alabama, they're the number 1 team in the country right now. They win both those games, and they're either 1 or 2. That's my point. Alabama, both these teams have not looked like complete teams, which is why, personally, I do not believe either of them will be in the college football playoff. But we have another week to see what happens, and that's what makes this all fun, because this ranking really doesn't matter outside of 5 and 6, which is why this is so complex.
Right, because TCU and USC, everybody in the top 4, like Georgia, Michigan, they're locks. No matter what, if they lose, they're locks.
I don't know about that.
I don't know if Michigan loses to Purdue. I don't know.
Lose to Purdue and get in over a 2-loss Alabama with great losses, and Michigan with the worst loss of all of them. I vehemently disagree with that.
Even in those situations, if Georgia and Michigan were to lose, they'd still have what Ohio State would have over Alabama. Just 1 loss. How much value do you give to just 1 loss over 2? You talked about, Alabama almost being the number 1 team in the country, but Alabama lost twice. You can't dance around that. You can't change that. And Ohio State has the 1 loss, Alabama has 2.
And the other thing you have to consider is, yes, you can weigh losses, but also you have to weigh wins. Ohio State has a win against a Penn State team that's currently ranked in the top 10.
That's funny.
On the road, Gabe. It's on the road. So Alabama, they go on the road against Tennessee and also LSU. They can't get the job done. Their wins are against Ole Miss, who, they lose in the Egg Bowl. Mississippi State, they win the Egg Bowl. And Who else? Arkansas.
Texas. Remember, they escaped Texas A&M as well, and they are not finishing the season ranked, even though they were in the top 10 to begin the season.
Their third ranked win was against Arkansas.
But yes, correct. But you got to remember, they also escaped Texas A&M, and they've honestly been pretty lucky in a couple of these games.
So, I mean, that's what it comes down to. Ohio State has the better win, but Alabama has, despite two, that have better losses. So, does the committee weigh wins more, or do they weigh losses more?
Depends on how highly they rank Texas tonight, because we all know they love themselves some Texas.
Dude, I love TCU. Their social media account with the meme videos.
Okay, so they're a Bills clone.
No, they're a horned frog. It's Frog Nation, baby. They got that frog in them.
But you're talking memes. Michigan did the same thing. Their video after they beat Ohio State was very Bills-esque. Yeah,
like they were just in shocked. Their TCU football was just shocked.
Well,
that
we'll
Michigan
see if
would have the
TCU
audacity.
football has the audacity to beat Kansas State and actually get in.
Because TCU and USC are playing some very great football right now. Some of the best football of their season. Because, I mean, you can look at Iowa State and say what you want, but I mean, the Big 12 has seemed to sort of cannibalize itself all year between Baylor, Kansas State, Kansas, Oklahoma State, Oklahoma as well, absolutely blowing out Oklahoma State or Texas, I believe, in Red River rivalry, and then also winning Bedlam. So it seems everybody except for TCU has been sort of cannibalizing itself in the Big 12, and everybody in the Big 12 has been sort of solid. So I could see that game going either way this year. And then I'm having a little bit of deja vu thinking about the Pac-12 championship, because you think back to last year where it was Utah versus Oregon. Utah blows out Oregon in the regular season, and the common mantra is if you play a team twice in a year, it's tough to beat them twice because that team has all the tape. The team that lost has all the tape, and they're going to make the correct adjustments. That didn't happen. Same result. Utah blows out Oregon in the Pac-12 championship. Now, fast forward to this season, Utah beats USC on the road by 1 point. Now they're going, I believe it's a neutral site game.
Vegas,
yeah, exactly. So you're going to the Sin City, and who knows how that game ends up. Does Utah have the ability to pull off a win against USC and the Heisman frontrunner twice this season?
Right, and that's the thing, is no game is ever the same. So I like the point you made, though, about TCU, and, they're playing their best football right now. And
so is USC.
It runs absolutely contrary to what Ohio State has been doing. Because, it seems like they almost maybe peaked mid-season, and then, as the season went on, injuries and other opportunities for that team kind of just derailed what could have been and still could be potentially even a championship season. But, you're always going to have adversity, and this year's Ohio State team just wasn't able to beat Michigan. Otherwise, we'd be having an entirely different discussion about what the future holds for the Buckeyes.
Right. It would be more of a conversation of which bowl or which CFP semifinal are they playing in. I'll counter what you said, though, with them peaking early and say they haven't peaked yet. Like I
would not disagree with
that.
Right,
they haven't played their – no, I get what you're saying. From what we've seen, they've already played their best football, and it's sort of been a little bit of a steep decline. However, I think their potential is still untapped, and if they're clicking on all cylinders, they could be the national champions, and they could be hoisting that trophy at the end of the year.
But I also think at this point in the year, I think it's possible that, we've said this for 2 years? They click at their highest potential. They could be the national champions. Hey, maybe they could beat Michigan if they played that well. But in reality, that's not a solution. It's not possible for this Buckeyes team as we've seen it so far.
Right, and that's why they're on the outside looking in, and they don't control their own destiny, and they're not going to be Big Ten champs for the second year in a row. Because, you look at – it's kind of funny to me. Going back to that Michigan game, Ohio State had a higher net success rate than Michigan, believe it or not. Ohio State's Michigan, their net success rate was 1/10 of a percentage, not necessarily, but you know what I mean. It was negative 0.1 less than Ohio State in analytic terms, which in the grand scheme of things, is pretty big. So for a team that lost by 22 points to have a higher success rate, it almost seems asinine. And you look at taking away those 75 and 85-yard runs from Michigan's rush total, then Ohio State, they only allow 92 yards on the ground on 33 carries, so that's about 3 yards a carry, approximately, a little less than that, honestly. And I mean, Ohio State, they're maybe sitting in a different situation, huh, Jacob?
Ohio State would definitely be sitting in a different situation because, and it's fascinating to consider because you look back at the numbers, Michigan only had 1 rushing yard after the first quarter,
Exactly.
10 after the first half, and it seemed like Ohio State was able to do exactly what it wanted to do and stop Michigan's run. It just, those big plays really came back to beat Ohio State, and I don't think Ohio State was expecting big, explosive plays to be the bane of its season, but I also remember early in the season that we would talk about, Ohio State gave up a 50-plus yard pass. Ohio State gave up 2 60-yard passes in this game. That's quite interesting. We'll see if Ohio State's secondary can work it out. And ultimately, I wouldn't pin that exact reason on why Ohio State lost it because I still think these explosive plays Michigan had were just that. They were explosive, big plays that, can go one way or another. But, if Ohio State sealed a couple of different things, maybe, and I'm sure Ryan Day's having this conversation with himself, it would look very different for the Buckeyes.
Just one final thought before we kind of wrap things up for this episode. No Blake Corum. Michigan did not have their best player for. I don't know if he did play a snap or
A
not.
couple snaps,
but
other than that,
2 carries.
But other than that, he was effectively not in the game, and they still won by 22. So, in lieu of no score predictions this week, Mr. Smith thought it'd be fun to guess ranking and bowl projection for Ohio State. So I will go. I think Ohio State is ranked 5th tonight, and I think they're headed to the Rose Bowl again.
What about final ranking? I think that's
Well, okay, then.
fitting. Are we doing this again next week? I mean,
Hey.
Rankings come out Sunday.
So yeah.
So let's.
So
get
I guess
final
we're going
ranking.
final. We're going
Yes,
final ranking.
Yeah.
Cinco Rose Bowl. That's my lock it in. That's my prediction for Ohio State.
All right. I think Mr. Smith gets to answer this one today, second, because he suggested the prompt. So I can either tail or fade.
Tail or fade.
Because I've already got this one. Only thing I can do is
my
draw, like I'm England. All I have to do is draw.
So here's my thought process. I think Ohio State is 5 in the penultimate college football playoff rankings. But then I think USC loses this weekend. I'm a big fan of Kyle Whittingham and what they have going on over there. I've seen Cameron Rising play in person. I've seen him rumble and bumble on a 4th and 2 down the sideline, shredding this Ohio State defense, and I think they get it done. I'm also a big fan of Caleb Williams. Watching that Notre Dame game, he sealed himself as the Heisman Trophy winner. But I think that Utah, they just find a way to get it done, and I think Ohio State squeaks in at number 4, and they're playing Georgia in the Peach Bowl.
Ooh, okay.
Did you just say Bucknuts?
For those that don't know, during the introductory coaches press conference, one of the Bucknuts contributors was going to ask a question, stated his affiliation. Head coach for Utah, Kyle Whittingham, stopped and before he could ask the question said, "Did you just say Bucknuts?"
And ultimately, Casey, I kind of agree with you. I think this weekend is going to get a little nuts. I think ultimately Ohio State is going to land number 5 in the penultimate CFP rankings. I still don't think the door is all the way closed for the Buckeyes. I still see a way where Ohio State can get into the college football playoff, and it's not going to feel the same at all if Ohio State gets in. Michigan's in there, of course, and everyone obviously is looking towards that rematch that would have to happen in the national championship. We can save that conversation for later. But at the end of the season, though, does Ohio State get in the CFP? It's going to take a lot of help. I also like that Utah team. I also like what Kyle Whittingham does. That has the potential to be the game of the year, USC and Utah in the Pac-12 championship game. Man, that's going to be a good one. TCU, I think, is probably going to be the sneaky team this weekend for people to watch. I don't think many people are going to be watching them, and I don't know if if Kansas State's going to pull off an upset, but we'll have to see. I think Ohio State is probably going to head down to Atlanta and play Georgia. If you're going to have to get the ultimate revenge against Michigan, you're going to have to dethrone the defending champion, and that's the Bulldogs.
This is what I get for picking to go last. Casey and Jacob, I'm spot on with a lot of things you guys said. However, I think both the Horned Frogs and USC have the potential to lose this weekend.
Agree.
Now, whether I'm going to pick, USC to fall with I'm dying. I think, USC's got all the tools to prevent that from happening. But I think, we've talked about Ryan Day in big games. I think Lincoln Riley in big games also needs to, we need to take a look and see what happens after this week. After, USC and TCU both lose. Ohio State and Alabama are both in. Ohio State's going to be 5 tonight. They're either going to be 5 or 6 tonight. Doesn't matter because both Alabama and Ohio State are going to shift up as TCU and USC lose. I think you're going to get your rematch of the game in Arizona, 2-3, Michigan and Ohio State in Arizona for all the marbles to play Georgia or Alabama. That way you have, Big Ten, SEC, teams that didn't get to play each other in their conference championship games. But I don't know. I guess we'll just have to wait and see because I think if in Arizona, I think I'd favor the Buckeyes in that rematch.
Right. I have to say, Gabe, you kind of took the words out of my mouth. Who would you pick, and what would your score prediction be in that rematch between the Buckeyes and Wolverines?
I think it'd be about 42-31 Buckeyes. I think Michigan's going to run the ball a lot more more effectively than they did in this game because a lot of their damage was done in the pass. So I think a healthy Blake Corum, I'd love to see that against this Swiss cheese defense. And then I'd also, on the other side, love to see Stetson Bennett face a bad Alabama defense. Historically, not as good all around because, either Georgia and Ohio State, Georgia and Michigan. Georgia and Michigan line up really well. I think that'd be a good matchup in the national championship. But, that's why they play the games. You never know. It's a playoff now, not just a BCS.
You play to win the game, in the words of the great Herm Edwards.
Victory Wembanyama is in this class, though, so I don't know about that.
And on that note, I think that's going to do it for episode 13 of the Lantern Sports Podcast. For Casey Smith, Jacob Benge, and Gabe Burggraf, I'm Steven Kishpaugh, and we'll see you in the next episode.